Read this week about a man who is a scout leader. And he was getting ready to take a group of Cub Scouts on a weekend retreat a couple weekends ago. And so he met all the parents and the kids at the appointed location, and they were getting ready to leave for their scouting trip. And the man was wearing a Penn State University baseball cap. And one of the parents said, "I don't think that's appropriate. You're leaving on this scouting trip. You're taking our children with you, and you are wearing a Penn State hat." Now, of course, we know what that parent was referring to. The child sexual abuse scandal that happened there, those heinous acts that were eventually probably covered up, as it appears, by folks in the administration. And so, in the mind of that parent, just the word, or the words Penn State University, evoked those kinds of thoughts. And so the scout leader was taken aback. How do you respond to that? He said, basically, to paraphrase this, he said, "I went to Penn State. I had a wonderful experience there. It's a great institution. I got a phenomenal education there. I met my wife at Penn State. My oldest child goes to Penn State. I love that school." And as I read his words and his defense of Penn State and his willingness to wear that cap proudly, I started thinking about my life and our lives together as a congregation. With whom do we identify? What colors do we wear, to use that metaphorically? If someone were to look at our lives, what would they say about us? What would they say in terms of the way we live our lives? How do we conduct ourselves? Are you and I Christians in such a way that others can see this by our deeds, by the way we live, our attitudes and actions? Or would it be difficult to distinguish between someone in this room and anyone else who happens to be walking out on Shelbyville Road right now? Another way to put it is, are you and I followers of Christ in such a way that our allegiance to Him is evident? What symbols do we bear in our lives by the way we live? What colors do we wear? We're talking about why church and going through our church's mission statement. We're going to talk about the story today of Jesus walking on the water. It's one of the most well-known stories in all the New Testament, and it's very significant for a lot of reasons. One is, it wasn't Jesus' custom to walk on water. I mean, when Jesus was on the water, He was normally in a boat. I mean, time and time again, we see Him sailing on the Sea of Galilee. That's the way He was transported, not by walking on water. When Jesus walked, typically He did it on dry land. And yet here we have this story of Him walking on the water on the Sea of Galilee. The Sea of Galilee was not just a little pond. The Sea of Galilee is probably 15 miles by 8 miles. It is a large body of water. The Sea of Galilee was often prone to strong winds at night, and storms would often crop up during the nighttime. And so sailors typically would make sure they were on the shore by the time it was at least dusk. So let's take a look at the story, and that kind of sets the stage for what we're reading. And immediately, He made the disciples get into the boat and go on ahead to the other side while He dismissed the crowds. And after He dismissed the crowds, He went up to the mountain by Himself to pray. And when evening came, He was there alone. But by this time, the boat, battered by waves, was far from the land, and the wind was against Him. And early in the morning, He came walking toward them on the sea. But when the disciples saw Him walking on the sea, they were terrified, saying, "It's a ghost." And they cried out in fear. But immediately Jesus spoke to them and said, "Take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid." Peter answered Him, "Lord, if it is You, command me to come to You on the water." And He said, "Come." So Peter got out of the boat and started walking on the water, and he came toward Jesus. But when he noticed the strong wind, he became frightened, and he began to sink. He cried out, "Lord, save me." Jesus immediately reached out His hand and caught him, saying to him, "You of little faith, why do you doubt?" When they got into the boat, the wind ceased. And those in the boat worshiped him, saying, "Truly you are the Son of God." What's going on in that story? They're out there. It's probably, it's 3 o'clock in the morning. The wind and the waves are crashing against the boat. There is turbulence underneath them from the sea, and then they see Jesus walking toward them. They were probably a mile or 2 off the shore. I'm sure they wiped the bleariness from their eyes and they refocused, and certainly that's him. He is literally on the water. Peter was that disciple who was always very impulsive. And he said, "Hey, I want to do the same." And so he asked Jesus, "Let me come toward you as well." And so Jesus said, "Absolutely, come." So Peter started literally walking on the water as he approached Christ. Suddenly he became afraid. And who wouldn't be? You're in the middle of the Sea of Galilee. It's dark, the wind and the waves and the storm. He took his eyes off of Christ. He began to sink. Jesus extended his hand, reached out, and saved him. I think this story is significant for a lot of reasons. Like I mentioned, it was not Jesus' custom to walk on water. And certainly that's a miracle that expresses the divinity of Christ and the power of God through him. But I think also it is a story about Peter. I think that you and I are asked or invited to see ourselves as that disciple. He attempted to do what was impossible. And as he was doing it, he found himself becoming fearful. He took his eyes off of Christ and he began to sink. I believe the sea and the storm represent the circumstances we all find ourselves in. The word circumstance means to stand around. And the truth is, you and I are surrounded by circumstances. Some of them are good. Some of them are easy. Some of them are very pleasant. Other circumstances are very difficult. And the key is, how do we react to them? Do we stand above the circumstances and keep them in their proper perspective? Or do we allow our circumstances to engulf us and overwhelm us? No. Storms happen, don't they, in life? I mean, the weather changes in each of our lives. Storms come. The rain beats against us. The wind beats against us. Hard times. I mean, at work, it can happen. Things are going well, and we're happy. Our employer is happy with us. Business is good, and then suddenly we see the clouds forming. And life begins to change at work, and it's not what it used to be. And perhaps we even lose our job. The storm is hit. The storm's hit in our personal lives. In our home, things are going well. And we're getting along with each other. And then suddenly there seems to be some tension in the house. And then some estrangement in the house. And then some anger in the house. And we have found ourselves in the middle of a storm. I mean, storms happen with our health. I mean, how many of us have had the experience in this room of feeling okay, going to the doctor, and the doctor saying, "You know, I've got some really bad news I need to tell you." Matt, you know what I'm talking about. Happened to you a couple of years ago. Storms happen in our spiritual lives when we just feel like suddenly there's just no sense of communion with God. You and I know what it's like to experience a storm, and they come upon us so fast. I was thinking about my 33rd birthday, November 16th, 1997. My life was a certain way. 5 years later, November the 16th, 2002, there was nothing in my life that even resembled 1997. It was completely different. And there was a storm there. And now as I think about 10 years later from that time, the sun is shining again. But we all experience that. Life has a way of doing that. And many of us do what Peter did. We become afraid. We become worried and filled with anxiety and confusion. That's what was going on with Peter. I mean, I think we live in a culture that is just fearful from the word go. And I found it, I'm a dog lover. Love our dog, Sally. I found an interesting study about dogs in this country. In the year 1975, let me just ask you, what do you think the most popular registered purebred dog in America was in 1975? Anyone want to hazard a guess? No. Poodles. Anybody think poodle? There were almost 200,000 purebred poodles registered in 1975. At that time, there were about 900 Rottweilers. Now, what's a Rottweiler? Symbol of power, often used as a guard dog. Today, guess how many registered poodles there are purebred in this country? About a fourth of what there were in 1975. Guess how many purebred Rottweilers there are? 900 of them in 1975. About 200,000. And Rottweilers, again, they are symbols of strength, and often they are used as guard dogs. We live in a very fearful world. And in the midst of Simon Peter's storm, when he became afraid, what did he do? He took his eyes off of Christ. And often when you and I find ourselves going through these difficult times, we do the same. You see, I believe that faith in some ways can be described as keeping our eyes on Christ. Purely and simply. When times are difficult, when the wind is raging, when that weather changes, whether it be at work or at home or with our health or our spiritual lives, rather than become afraid, I think we learn here to have an active faith, to focus on Christ, to keep our eye on Christ. When I learned how to drive, it was just coming out of the gas lines and all that in the 70s. It was 1981. And money was tight, and I hated to waste fuel, much like my son does today. I just hate to waste fuel. And it was expensive. And so I learned from a friend of mine a little secret about saving gas. He said, when we're on the highway or on the interstate, if you can find a big truck, or maybe even an 18-wheeler, if you'll tuck in behind that truck and draft off of that truck, you won't use nearly as much fuel. Anybody ever do that whenever you were young? Draft? I'm the only one in this room who ever did that. I used to put my car in neutral going down the hills with that kind of tightness. And so, no, we learned how to draft behind those big old trucks. And that they would just kind of pull us along and we'd save gas. I mention that because I think a lot of us in our faith just sort of want to coast and just sort of want to draft and just sort of want to get by. Our faith enables us to walk on water, to do that which would seem impossible, quote unquote. These storms call on us to do that which we cannot do by ourselves. These storms ask you and ask me to walk on water. It was a miracle what happened there. And I believe that miracles happen in our lives all the time. Now, when I was in seminary, there was a school of thought that said that miracles in the Bible were simply not true. That they could just be explained away. In fact, I had a student grad assistant in a seminary class say that on the Sea of Galilee there were all kinds of sandbars. Jesus was just probably walking on a sandbar. And he said it in such a way that he had this great assurance that he understood how this happened. And the truth is, I knew the guy. He probably didn't know how to check the air pressure in his tires. But yet he could tell us this miracle didn't happen. What is a miracle? Here's what St. Augustine, the great saint of the church, wrote. Miracles are not a contradiction of nature. They are only a contradiction of what we know of nature. And I think God still does it in our lives. When it seems like this storm cannot be overcome, God does the miraculous. When it seems like we just are not going to make it, we just don't have it, God extends his hand to us. As a church, we grow together as followers of Christ, as disciples, because life demands that we be tough. And life demands that we be faithful when God calls us to. Christ reaching out to Simon Peter is a symbol of what God does for us. God helps us when we cannot help ourselves. God enables us to walk on water. In our church's vision statement, we've talked the last couple of weeks about how we're to be a welcoming church. And that's one of the reasons that we maintain this place as we do. We want it to be welcoming and the doors to be open. Mike talked last week about how we are a church family. We care for each other. I think this story this morning reminds us that we are also called to develop our relationships with Christ together, to be disciples together, to grow together. We need to do that. I mean, why do we support Trinity? In my mind, one of the reasons I do, and my wife does, is that this church is focused and intentional when it comes to developing disciples. We are learning together how to keep our eyes on Christ when the going gets tough, and when the storms are raging, and when the weather changes, as it always does. We're very serious about that. That's who we are. Mike, you said something to our youth a couple weeks ago, and it really struck a chord with me. Mike was meeting with our youth and their parents, and he was laying out his vision for youth ministry as he was going to do it. And again, to paraphrase you, he basically said these words: our teenagers experience a tremendous amount of temptation. Our teenagers are under an incredible amount of pressure. That's just the world these 15, 16, and 17-year-olds are living in. He said, what I want to do is help them have the faith and equip them in such a way that when it's midnight and they are confronted with a difficult decision, they'll be able to do the right thing. I can think of no better reason to support this church financially than to do that with our little ones that Linda is working with, and our middle-aged ones that Mike is working with. And the truth is, with all of us as adults, hey, we've made the right call at midnight, we've made the wrong call at midnight. But that's what discipleship is, giving us that ability. Life calls for it. In closing, there's a great, and I used this a couple years ago, but I want to hear it again. There's a funny story about a 36-year-old named Roy Robert Smith. Now, Roy Robert Smith lives in Denver, Colorado, and he is profiled in Ripley's Believe It or Not. And here are some of the things that Roy Robert Smith, physically completely healthy, able to do whatever he wants to do. Here's some things he's never done in his life by age 36. He's never had ice cream. He's never had a sip of Coca-Cola or ginger ale. He's never gone hunting, swimming, fishing, hiking, ice skating. He's 36 years old. He's never driven a car. He's never ridden a motorcycle. He's never been on a horse. He's never ridden a bicycle. He's never had a surgical operation. He's never joined any organization in his entire life. No church, club, or lodge. He's never studied a foreign language. He's never been outside the United States. He's never kissed a girl. He's 36. My hunch is he's never done any of these things. Why? Because he's just afraid and trying to kind of protect himself and live in this little cocoon. We can't live in that cocoon. No matter how hard we try, storms are going to happen. We are out there living our lives. And so together, we develop our sense of what it means to be a follower of Christ. So that we can keep our eyes on Christ when we find ourselves